Okay, welcome to today's talk on the Babylonian exile and the first creation story. So a little background information here before we get into looking at the Babylonian exile with the help of the text on Genesis by Mary Catherine Berg. We want to look at what was going on in Israel when the exile happened. Well, if we look at the Israelite nation, we can see references to it in historical documents and artifacts back around as early as 1200 BC. So it seems by that time these people who identified themselves as Israelites were flourishing on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. So they kind of existed at this time, seems like a loose confederacy, that they had their identification as other peoples, as other tribes, but then they also saw themselves united as part of a larger Israelite nation. So they had something shared in their identity. And they would help each other fight off other invading tribes. We read stories that reflect that in the Bible. Around 1000 BC, it seems that the kingship was made, that the Israelite tribes adopted a king. And traditionally this is David. Historians debate, biblical scholars and archaeologists are looking at evidence now to see how much of a king David really was, or if he was kind of more of a legendary character to kind of help prop up his son Solomon's dynasty. Regardless, you do see the Israelite tribes being referred to as a kingdom around 1000 BC sometime. Then you had the reign of Solomon within that time, and Solomon is a bona fide historical figure. No historians doubt his historical legitimacy as an actual king who ruled over this area. But Israel as a kingdom didn't last very long, only about 100 years before it split into a north and south. So the north was all the northern tribes, aka every tribe except for Judah and Benjamin, and Simeon, which is kind of included in Judah geographically. But after that split, then you actually have two kingdoms ruling with their own separate kings and understood as two nations in most ways. In 722 BC, then the northern tribes, which were called Israel, they were conquered by the Assyrians, and they kind of disappear. They basically do assimilate into Assyrian culture, although many aspects of the Israelite culture remain among in the conquered areas of northern Israel, even still today. Later on, Judah is conquered by the Babylonians. 587 BC was the date of the second siege of Babylon, and usually taken as the beginning of the exile. So that's where we're stepping in there today to talk about this exile experience when Judah was defeated and many of the Jews were sent into exile by the Babylonians in 587 BC. So the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem twice, one in 598 BC and then later again in 587 BC. So there were kind of two movements in the exile. But during the second siege of Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple. Now the temple was very important. It was the center of the Jewish religious and cultural life. And it came to be known as the only place where you could offer sacrifices to God, which was a major movement in the Jewish and Israelite religious tradition. It was also believed to house the Holy of Holies, it was also believed to house the Shekinah in the Holy of Holies. Now the Shekinah is called the glory of God, and it was the visible sign of God's presence among his people. So it was housed in the back of the temple, and no one could go in there to see it because it was so holy. It was believed you really couldn't handle it. Only the high priest would go in there once a year, let it shine on his face, and then he'd come out and let the glory of God reflect off of his face onto the people. So it was a sign of the unity of the nation and the center of the religious and cultural life. So it was a big deal, we'll see, when it was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar then took control of Judah, and he exiled the Jews from Judah, right? People from Judah, that's what Jews means in this case, or at that time. And he exiled them, not all of them. When one country conquers another and doesn't exile, they don't usually exile everybody. But he exiled people who might be influential in a revolt. People like landowners, people who were related to the royal family, people who had lots of money, people who were skilled artisans and laborers, amongst others. Scribes, educated people, people who knew how to write and read. These various groups who were kind of leadership in some way of the Jewish communities. They were taken to live in Babylon. Now, things were not that bad for them in Babylon. Compared to some other groups they could have been conquered by, like the Assyrians who conquered the north, the Babylonians didn't treat the Jews very badly in exile. They kind of just brought them in and let them live in relative freedom with the hope that they would assimilate and just basically then turn into Babylonians. Good move, right? Less of the people you conquer, more of you. So what was it like for Jews living in Babylon in the early exile period? Well, actually, in a lot of ways, most of them did better than they had in Judah. They had better farmland to work with. They had a nice skill set. I mean, you had people who were living in Judah, and they kind of knew how to live off the land. But in Babylon, they had more water. They were less susceptible to famine. It was also safer there. They didn't have to worry about marauders invading their villages and towns as much because the capital city of Babylon kind of offered protection from those things. So it was kind of a good life, and most of the Jews did very well, or at least a lot better than they had done in Judah during the exile. Of course, living there with the Babylonians, they were exposed to the Babylonian culture, language, and religious life. Many of the Jews started to speak Aramaic, Babylonian language that was not far from their native tongue. So, I mean, it kind of looks like the Babylonian idea would work. You know, they're here, they're living with the Babylonians, things are going nicely. You would expect them to assimilate within a couple generations, as typically happens. Okay, so life was kind of good for the Jews in exile in Babylon. What were they missing? Well, a couple important parts of their identity. Number one, the temple. As I already mentioned, it was the center of their religious and cultural life. It was the place that they really thought they had a specific connection with God on earth, and they believed that it would last forever. The other thing they were missing was the land, their own land, their own country, their land that was promised to them by God, and they thought that this was supposed to be a forever promise, right? In their stories, foundational stories, God promises the land to Abraham and his descendants forever. And so they thought, that was given to them from God and it would never be taken away. So they had to answer the question. That was a big question that plagued them. Why did they lose their land? This land that God had promised their ancestors when they were supposed to have it forever. Again, it kind of looks like things are lining up in a way that, hey, well, the Jews are probably just going to assimilate and become nice Babylonians, right? Well, what happens? Well, again, let's look at those Jews born and raised in Babylon. They would have known the Jewish stories, right? So let's say you didn't experience the exile. Your parents were exiled into Babylon, and you were born, you grew up there. You would have heard about the Jewish God, right? You would have heard about Yahweh. You would have heard about the promised land and how God had promised it to the people, to your people. You would have heard about the temple and how your family would go there several times a year, even if you weren't that close to Jerusalem, and how you would offer sacrifices to God there, and the other experiences associated with the temple. It was a real unifying factor in Israelite and therefore Jewish life. But you also would have grown up in the Babylonian culture. You would have felt home there. You would have spoke Aramaic. You would have been at home with the religious practices and ideas that went on in Babylon. You would have heard the Enuma Elish recited. That's the Babylonian creation story. You would have heard it recited in the streets during religious festivals every year growing up. You would have been familiar with it. Now, you also would have known the roots of the Israelite creation story in chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, kind of your own story of the origins of the world, right? But the question comes up, living in Babylon, doing well in Babylon, having a nice life in Babylon, why didn't the Jews, especially the first generation or second generation Jewish exiles, why didn't they just start practicing the Babylonian religion? Why didn't they fully assimilate? Well, there were some specific efforts made by the priests and scribes within the Jewish community that helped to keep Jews Jewish. Okay? One thing was the synagogue. This was a form of Jewish religious practice that still lives on today. As a matter of fact, it's the primary form of Jewish religious practice today. And the synagogue was a place. The priests and the scribes would set aside a place where people would come together to study the Torah, to talk about God, and to engage in other Jewish religious and cultural activities. Right? They didn't have the temple anymore, but what they did have was the Torah. So they would say prayers from the Torah, and they would also come together to study the Torah. Right? That was another function of the synagogues. They also started to resurrect and reinstitute some old teachings that really weren't followed that strictly in Judah before the exile. Right? These were signs that showed that the Israelites were God's chosen people. It showed their identity in an outward way, and that was the kosher food laws. Before the exile, it doesn't seem that most Israelites, or in this case, Jews, were following the kosher laws very strictly. It didn't really seem like a big deal. But during exile, it suddenly becomes a huge deal. They really focus in on it. And people there, and the priests and the scribes are calling people to follow these kosher laws strictly, and they become a real part of Jewish life. Now, this then has the effect of Jews enclaving even more. It kind of brings the Jews together because, hey, if you can only eat certain foods and then you're all eating different foods from the rest of the people, you don't want to go eat with the other people because they might have unclean foods. What are you going to do? You're going to live and eat with each other. So it serves in a way, a similar way, to the way that not using electricity helps to preserve the Amish culture. Male circumcision was another thing. Again, not that big of a deal before the exile, but during the exile, the priests and the scribes started to proclaim this as a necessary and very important part of being a Jewish male. So it really started to be more of a universal practice among the Jews. And finally, the Sabbath. The Sabbath was an exile era development. So the priests and the scribes started encouraging people to rest on the Sabbath. Don't work all day, every day all week. Take one day a week, set it aside to read about God, to learn about God, to study the Torah, to meet together with other Jews and pray together and focus together and eat together and do other things as a Jewish community. So the Sabbath here, the day of rest, was instituted during the exile period. Now you'll see it's written back. It's going to be written back into the very foundations of the world, the very origins of the world. But it seems that as a practice, there's not much evidence of this, or maybe any evidence of it, before the Babylonian exile period. So the priests and the scribes did a lot of writing during the exile too. They had brought with them scrolls from the royal scribes in Solomon's court and the courts of the kings that came after Solomon. And so they brought these scrolls and these writings, and then when they were in the exile, they read them, and they put them together, and they edited them and changed them. Now, they did have a certain respect for them. They didn't change like a lot of elements of the stories. Sometimes they would keep a story intact, but they would stick little explanations in between them, or they would stick little extra pieces of action in the stories, right? And in this way, they were going to create a new story, or they were going to modify or redact the stories that they had from the royal scribes hundreds of years ago, and use them to answer the questions that their contemporary exiles would have. Like, why did they lose the land? Why did God allow them to be defeated by the Babylonians? Had God abandoned them? Was God even real? Was God weaker than the Babylonian gods? And what are they supposed to do now? Right? The vision of an exile wasn't part of the Israelite vision for their future. So when it happened, the scribes and the priests in exile had to answer a lot of questions. And they had to re-envision what it meant to be an Israelite under these new conditions. So these were tough questions, and they're going to need deep reflective answers, right? So what the priestly writers wanted to do was to go back to the very meaning of what it meant to be Israelite, right? And so they're going to go back to the origin stories, right? Remember that for the ancient Near Eastern cultures, for the ancient Near Eastern people, if you wanted to understand something, you wanted to go right to its origin, because that's when its essence was the purest, the cleanest, the least obscured. And so in order to give the Israelites a new vision of who they were, one that would work in their current circumstance, they went back to the very foundations of humanity and the very foundations of the world. And they're going to write a new creation story. So they wanted the people to understand that God was still present with them, God was still working with them in their lives, even though they had lost the land and the temple. So they offer a vision of God and humanity that is going to help the Jews in the exile, right? And they're not going to reinvent the wheel here. They're not changing the idea of who the Israelites are. They're expanding their identity so that it can encompass this exile experience, right? Now, they also are going to juxtapose their vision to the Babylonian worldview, right? They're definitely saying, we don't want to become Babylonians, and so they're gonna offer kind of an alternative to the Babylonian way of understanding things. They already had their own origin story, which is the roots of Genesis 2-3, but the priestly writers during the exile felt that they needed something more. They felt that the roots of the Genesis 2 and 3 story weren't really enough to get the message across of the way that God was present with them and working through their current situation. So what did they do? They turned to the popular creation myth in Babylon. Okay, now remember, like a lot of the Jews, like they're growing up in Babylon, they kind of maybe on some level just assume the Babylonian creation stories. I mean, that's the way assimilation works. That's the way that a good exile works. You know, people don't even realize that they are assimilating, and bam, but then there they are at some point. So you see, in these subconscious ways, they're hearing the creation story presented in the streets, just like you might hear the scientific creation story presented on Discovery Channel or something. And you just kind of start to assume it. You say, oh, yeah, sure, the Big Bang, yeah, sure. Right? Even if you never looked into how legit it is or not. Well, the same thing is happening to them. They hear about, the creation of the world by Marduk and Ea and some of these other Babylonian deities. And they said just probably figured it was something like that, right? So the exile era priests are going to use the cultural assumptions of the Babylonian culture in which they are submerged to create a new creation story, a new origin story. And you can see that how Genesis kind of uses the framework of the Enuma Elish here in various ways. So if you look at the framework there, it seems like a legitimate theory to say, hey, Genesis is kind of a adaptation. Genesis 1 is kind of an adaptation of Enuma Elish, or maybe you want to say Genesis 1 uses the basic framework of the Enuma Elish, but it's definitely structured in a way that it would be somehow connected to the Enuma Elish creation story for the Babylonian era exiles, right? In the very least, it would be seen as as the same kind of story, and therefore challenging it, and challenging the assumptions that the Enuma Elish makes. Right. So what they basically did was rewrite and reinterpret the Enuma Elish. Now, they made a lot of changes. Right? You're going to see it's quite a different story than the video on the Enuma Elish that you watched already. And the changes that they make there, that's where you're saying, hey, well, this is different. And with our historical critical minds today, we can say, well, why did they change that part? Right? If they started with the basic framework, why did they make it different than they did? Right? We understand why they would start with a framework. They would say, okay, this part's the same, in order to tap into the cultural assumptions that were already there, right? And to present their story as a parallel story to the Enuma Elish. But why did they change stuff? Well, they changed stuff because it didn't fit with their beliefs about God and the nature of the human person, right? So they made their own version of the dominant worldview. And then the differences there, that's the key to understanding the author's intention, right? Again, why did they change this stuff? Why didn't they just, if they left some of the story like it was, why didn't they leave all the story like it was? If they started using the framework, why did they change details so significantly? So if we look at 5 differences here between Genesis 1 and the Enuma Elish, you can see maybe what the priestly writers were trying to say with their new creation myth. Right? So in Enuma Elish, you have many gods and demigods creating many different things. In the priestly creation story, one God creates everything. Again, this is a metaphysically profound statement because you're saying everything has one source. Right? And they're saying, hey, there's one God, Yahweh, right, our God, that created the whole universe, everything in it. Right? In Enuma Elish, the gods are creating through sex and violence. Right? They're killing each other and making new things out of their parts. They're procreating with each other. It is a kind of a wild show there, right? Not in the priestly creation story, right? God is simply creating the world through speech, through his self-expression, right? Again, we do see some pretty significant metaphysical ideas here, right? It's going to shape the way we see the world, right? The whole world is God sharing and expressing himself. That's much different than the world being the result of people following their sexual urges and then murdering each other, right? The Enuma Elish basically presents a chaotic world. It's something that just kind of gets going out of control because people make a few decisions. The gods, they procreate and then they don't like the way people are acting, and then one thing leads to another. Not in the priestly creation story. The world is very orderly. It's planned, right? Everything God creates is good. It's done in an orderly fashion. We'll look at the patterns of it are very reliable and induce that sense of order and reliability. In the Enuma Elish, the land is fertile. The people are fertile. The animals. That all comes through the sexual activity of the gods and goddesses. In the priestly creation story, the fertility comes as a blessing through God's blessing. So again, there's not some of this impulsive maybe activity that we see with the divinities in the Enuma Elish. And then finally, in the Enuma Elish, humans are created almost as an afterthought. Like all this stuff goes down, now there's this world. Gosh, it's really hard to take care of it. It's a pain in the butt to farm. You're constantly having to look out for all the floods and stuff that are happening in the Mesopotamian basin. It's rough. It's not as rough as things were in the Israelite land, but still, it's still not easy to live an agrarian lifestyle. It still takes a lot of work. And so the gods are like, well, we don't want to do that. Oh, well, let's just make humans. Yeah, humans will do all that stuff. That's great. He'll make all that food, and then they'll give offerings to us and stuff like that. Basically, they'll do our work for us. So the humans are created as an afterthought and as a servant or even slaves, some people interpret it, for the gods. That's not the way it is in Genesis 1. No, the priestly writers are changing that. They're saying, no, that doesn't fit with what we believe about human beings. We think that human beings are created on purpose, right? They're the pinnacle of God's creation in a certain way. They're the only beings that are talked about as being the image and likeness of God, right? So they have a special dignity. They're not created as the servants or beast of burden for the gods. No, they're created out of God's own desire to share himself. He makes beings like himself in his image and likeness. So other things we see in the text that kind of show a difference between the Enuma Elish and the priestly creation story is the repeated phrasing. There's a sense of order in planning because in every movement of creation, God says, every day of creation, he says, and God said, let there be something, and then there's something. And then after it's all named, they say, and God saw that it was good, right? And then it says, and then there was evening, and there was morning, and it names the day, right? That pattern is repeated over and over, which then induces a sense of orderliness, reliability, reasonability to the universe, right? Also, the way that God names the light and darkness, this would have been very sufficient for, very significant for the ancient Near Eastern people. Because remember, when before the world was created, it's just chaos. And in the Babylonian story, a lot of that chaos continues. But in the Israelite story, in the priestly story, you have the chaos, but then the Spirit is hovering over the waters. So the Spirit is always there. And then the Spirit kind of brings order to the chaos, right? God brings order to the chaos. And he ends up naming the light and the darkness. Now the darkness represents the chaos. So it's showing you that God is going to put a name on the darkness. That would mean in the ancient world that God controls the darkness, right? God is in control of chaos. And then finally, the seventh day, when God rests, that reflects the exile era development of the Sabbath day. And it's bringing attention to it. So although this practice was started in the exile period, it's written into the very foundations of the world by the priestly writers. So in other words, if you look at the differences between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1, you'll see that the priestly writer is kind of offering the Jews living in Babylon a metaphysical choice. He's asking them, what kind of world do you want to live in, right? What do you want your worldview to be? Which one do you think is better? Do you want to see yourself as a slave to the forces of chaos and violence in the world, like in the Enuma Elish? Or do you want to see yourself as a dignified expression of God's goodness and order in the world, like in Genesis?